Thank you for joining the GeoScience and GeoEnergy webinar of the 6th of August 2020. I'm Maren Brehme from TU Delft, a colleague of Hadi, who could not make it today, so I try to replace it as good as I can. It's my pleasure to host you all together with Sebastian Geiger from Heriot-Watt. We are especially grateful to all our keynote lecturers who accepted our invitation and to all of you for joining us this week and combat work from home isolation. Please subscribe also to our YouTube channel so you can see all the lectures which have been given and also the upcoming talks. To our student attendees, please attend the Porous Media Tea Time Talk series to share your research and broaden also your network. Now to the lecture. We are pleased to announce our keynote speaker of this week, Professor Masa Prodanovic from University of Texas in Austin. Masa is Associate Professor at the Hildebrand Department of Petroleum and Geosystems Engineering at the University of Texas since September 2016. She is working in this department already since 2010. Masa holds the Bachelor of Science in Applied Mathematics from the University of Zagreb in Croatia, and also a PhD in Applied Mathematics and Statistics from Stony Brook University in New York. Her research interests include multiphase flow and image-based porous media characterization, especially applied to heterogeneous porous media, pore network models, shale gas flow, particulate flow, and formation damage, as well as sediment mechanics, fracturing, and ferrohydrodynamics. Masa's excellent research has been recognized by internationally through several awards. In 2019, she received the SPE Formation Evaluation Regional Award for the development of the Digital Rocks portal. You can find more information and the links to the portal on her webpage. In 2017, she received the Texas 10 Top Faculty and the Stony Brook 40 Under 40 Awards. Already in 2014, she was awarded the SPE Faculty Innovative Teaching Award. And also in 2014, she has received the Interpor Procter & Gamble Research Award for porous media research. On top of that, she organizes and instructs multiple international short courses on digital rock physics. It's our pleasure and honor to host Masa today in our Geoscience and Geoenergy webinar of this week. To the audience, please note her lecture will last for about 30 minutes, followed by questions and discussions. Like before, please type your questions in the chat room, and Sebastian will go through them after the talk. Masa, thanks once more. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much for your very kind invitation, and it is my pleasure to present today. And the topic of my talk will be, what does it take to automate digital rock petrophysics? Now, if you just want to go and snooze now, I'm going to tell you immediately, it takes lots of experimental data, simulation, validation, and deep learning algorithms. So let's get going. First, I would like to extend my greetings from Central Texas. We are now seeing temperatures daily on the order of in triple digits, 100 Fahrenheit degrees. If you like Celsius scale, this is what it translates to, but it's equally hot. And the way we deal with this heat is typically with access to water, which we actually have plenty of. Now, pre-COVID time, we were socializing kayaking quite a bit. And you can see some of the authors of the work to be presented hiding within here. Here is Mr. Santos, Mr. Joe, Dr. Birch, and myself. So if we have a chance to host you in Texas, we'd like to take you kayaking after the COVID situation goes away. Now, during the COVID isolation, we can do that in multiple state parks. I'm showing you Colorado Bend State Park, where there's, again, a lot of water. And we have learned, especially in this heat, that swimming hole happiness is provided to you by your local limestone, which some of the limestone will be featured in this talk as well. And you can see actually here, this is technically a collapsed cave in a limestone formation that was filled by spring water. Now, to the topic of the talk, digital rocks may simply mean imaged rocks. And the objective is to use them to, in petroleum engineering, improve well log interpretation. Now, in petroleum engineering, again, we might along a well take multiple samples, and those samples are then taken for imaging. And here you can see one such sample. This is about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeter core. And then you can use multiple different imaging technologies at different resolutions. So as you go from millimeters down to microns, you can ultimately see such details as fluids in the pore space or grains. More textual information, this is typically done by X-ray imaging, and it's actually three-dimensional. I'm showing cross-sections. Now, more textual information comes from microscopy. SEM image example here shows basically mineralogy of the grains and such details as some healed fractures going through this sample. Now, we are after petrophysical properties, such as porosity, permeability, relative permeability, capillary pressure, saturation functions, formation factor, Young's modulus. I will mostly in this talk focus on permeability, but the same story really could apply to all of the other petrophysical properties. This is sort of a petroleum engineering view because I come from petroleum engineering department, but this is also in hydrology in general. In subsurface, you're typically after these physical properties. Imaging itself has already been introduced by previous talks in this series, so you had a chance to hear from Drs. Blunt or Knude, and those were really imaging focused on what you can actually find out by imaged experimentation, but imaging was also featured in many other talks in this series as well. So if you haven't seen these talks, I highly advise that you do. So what about how are we using imaging? Imaging can provide one way to upscale properties in porous media. And let me explain that through flow and permeability. So on the pore scale, in between different grains, here you see an image of a sandstone. You really just see the grain surface that is sort of see-through. We have Navier-Stokes equation, which is a highly nonlinear equation that is difficult to solve. Here I'm presenting it for a single fluid, but it does apply in individual fluids if I have multiple fluids with an additional term near the interface of those fluids. Now, on the larger scale, we're looking at the effective law, which is Darcy's law, which looks at the Darcy velocity, which is a flux normalized by area, and it relates it to essentially gradient in pressure, property of the fluid, which is viscosity, and property of the formation, which is permeability. And this is sort of we need a relationship for this permeability, and that can come by multiple ways. Now, we need to, in the process, bridge essentially micron scale to meter scale and above. So what can provide this permeability? It can be simulation, it can be experimental data, or it can be theoretical analysis. All of them come up with some sort of a functional relationship that relates permeability to possibly some other properties such as porosity. So here's one example how you fit experimental data. This is relatively old classic paper where there was a lot of measurements of permeability in a Fontainebleau sandstone, and then you can fit a curve and get the relationship you want in terms of permeability versus porosity. So this is a simple view, and it works for sandstones where you have really just a function of porosity. For different other formations, you would kind of change this relationship, so you have to do quite a bit of experimentation. What do we do in digital rock physics? Well, again, we take a sample, we image a small portion of it. So note that I have changed the scale considerably in this subset, which is deemed representative of this entire rock. And then we basically simulate flow through this sample. Here's one example of velocity streamlines. I have removed everything else other than this velocity in this image. Now, this is something that is rather intense and takes on the order of hours on high performance computing. But once you have the velocity field, then you can integrate it to find the flux you need, and you can compare to the Darcy's law to find permeability. Again, you need multiple data points, so you need to integrate quite a number of data points to actually get a relationship such as here. So that is the process. Now, if we have something more complicated, such as limestone, I did say that it's going to feature, then this shows that data could show quite a scatter, and you have different rock. So you need to bring in much more additional information to divide the rock into different classes, and then each class can possibly get a relationship. In this case, it's actually a power law relationship. It's a log scale that I'm showing here. So it's a much more involved process, and these measurements could be quite time consuming. Okay, so let me show you on the pore scale what is the problematic part of limestone and why do we see such a scatter. We see scatter because we see scatter in the sizes of the pore feature. Now remember that collapsed cave that I show you, that cave is formed of a dissolution, and you can see a dissolution feature here, which is on smaller scale called a VUG. So this is sort of a cave on the micro scale. And in this is imaged chalk. You don't see microporosity because resolution of 3 microns in this image was not enough to actually resolve it. So this part is quite microporous. Then we have a fracture-like dissolution feature as well as VUG. And all of those things are communicating together. Now, if you can image them, here I'm showing an image cutting through this VUG. You can see VUG in the back that is connecting to the fracture. Then you can approach it with simulation and attempt to get the properties you want. So here is one example. This is from quite some old work now of displacement using level set methods, where I'm basically displacing wetting fluid with non-wetting coming from the back. This is my rendering of the space of the pore grain surface, and you will see during drainage the non-wetting fluid is coming in. It has a red color where it's facing the other fluid, and it has gray color when it's interfacing the rock. And this is basically a movie of different quasi-static steps during this process. Okay. And then when we go back, the problem with porous media is that things are never really reversible. So when I go back, I might actually trap some fluids. So when my wetting fluid is coming in during imbibition, you will actually see some trapped blobs show in blue, even in this fracture. So this is not a very complicated porous medium, the way porous media go. So I have already shown you it's irreversible. What we're typically after is measurements from this simulation. The simulation in itself, just like an imaged experiment in 3D, it provides understanding of what is actually happening on the small scale. Now, this is one type of property that could go into upscaled information. So in sum, for conventional simulation on this scale, we require 3D microstructure. And most commonly, you will see single and two-phase flow. The geometry is deemed as the primary thing that is governing the flow, but you could add a mineral content and wettability information to it as well. Now, current computational power limits direct modeling of three-phase flow, any complex fluids. I'm going to show you one example here of a particulate suspension flowing through a porous medium, which is part of the research PhD thesis of my student Maren. Any kind of process modeling where I have coupling of different processes such as cementation and dissolution, particulate invasion, and so forth in multiple scales. Those approaches all exist. However, they're quite limited right now by computational power. So I would nevertheless say that we are right now at this point at a confluence of both data and simulation. Imaging in itself happens over larger and larger samples and in time, and it provides knowledge and simulation input for any kind of validation of simulation. And there's a number of different techniques that have recently been developed to go with finer and finer resolution. Open source parallel software, as well as high performance computing, is much more widely available. And these are, again, all open source parables for lattice Boltzmann method, finite volume methods with OpenFOAM, OpenPNM, LSMPQS, ParaView as a visualizing tool, and so forth. There's no way I can list all of them. As well as I will touch upon how machine learning helps in this as well, and those type of platforms are as well, and software are as well open source. And finally, we need data, and we need the ability to share the data, and there are portals bringing data and simulation together that are emerging quite literally as we speak. I will feature one of them, Digital Rocks portal, but there's also Open Porous Media Initiative. So our outstanding problems is that we do have data acquisition that is constantly improving, but using that data is the bottleneck, so real-time processing of it. Are we sharing enough of the data to actually come up with upscaling relationships? That's a problem. 3D image reconstruction and processing in real time is a problem. There's still uncertainty in fundamental image segmentation. And then simulation takes hours to days to complete on high performance computing centers. And in order to link across length and time scales in simulation, we need to be able to bridge that and cut down simulation hours. This is really true for many industry segments, not just imaging related scientific inquiry in porous media. Now, I've been data sharing or trying to organize data sharing since 2015, sort of before it was cool. Now, any AGO journal will force you to publish your data. This is under FAIR Data Initiative, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So you can go to Digital Rocks portal yourself. That was developed with the help of TAC, Texas Advanced Computing Center, and NSF. And some example data sets are here that have been, a lot of them have been posted for 2 or 3 years, and you can actually see their reuse. We track number of downloads, and you can see that all of them, this is the total number of downloads and how many images that total is for. You can see quite a wide range of images, from tight gas to carbonates to sandstones, and they're all downloaded quite a number of times. Okay. Now, our objective here is to basically speed up permeability, and then we hope that all other properties follow. We assume a segmented image is available, such as those on Digital Rocks portal, and we would like to leverage computer vision developments and optimized hardware in form of GPUs to provide fast and accurate fluid flow prediction through, hopefully down the line, multi-scale representative elementary volumes. So let me just introduce computer vision. Most of you know about and probably participate in visual data traffic on the internet. It basically represents more than 90% of the internet traffic. So computer vision is the fastest growing area in artificial intelligence that basically helps processing that data. So one can always dispute what is the data for, and whether all of these cat videos we can find online are the best use of our computational resources. However, there is no doubt that that actually drives some scientific advances as well, as I'm going to show. So we will actually borrow a lot of these algorithms and apply them to our problem of flow in porous media. Artificial intelligence approaches have plenty of data. Social media data is volunteered. But even in that area, you need about 1,000 examples per feature that are needed for training. I'm going to introduce neural network to recognize it. So in terms of scientific translation of these advances, we need quality benchmarks. So I will question that using data inside just in within one research group or one company has sort of a built-in bias, so we need to share more data in order to validate scientific. Now, computers do learn. They learn good and bad. You might have heard, this was basically a month ago or so, that there's images in tiny images that were linked to a RedNet database, and that brought in some labels that were essentially racial slur, and were subsequently then pulled away from those images. So people volunteer data, but with that they volunteer what they know. I would argue that any kind of bias that appears in this data sets does not necessarily translate in science. In science, we want trained people, such as geoscientists that are labeling the images. We want their bias because their bias comes from the years of training in science. So let me show you what actually happened in terms of, and what do we want to actually, what technology transfer do we want to make? So if you look at there has been image classification challenges. Again, there's lots of benchmarks in this volunteered data. And basically you can see over the years how the error by algorithms, this is error in percent by algorithms, how it basically fares against a human classification. And it is actually in year 2015 that algorithms have surpassed the human labeling precision. And that is thanks to convolutional neural networks that I'm going to introduce. And again, nota bene, benchmark datasets for these type of efforts are widely available and downloadable. So just a quick primer on artificial neural networks. They come from a neuron, or what neuron technically does. So neuron takes input, in our case visual input, but it could be really any input, and those inputs are labeled as X, and looks for the weights to assign them. And then that assigned weighted sum is then processed with an activation function, which is essentially a type of thresholding that gives you output label. Okay? So basically you're linking multiple inputs labeled with X to an output. And this can really be applied to anything. In our case, we're using imaged inputs, but inputs could be things such as, oh, let me link porosity to an output that is permeability if you have the data to train it with. So that is a single neuron. However, they're actually organized or combined into networks. So you have an input layer with multiple inputs, and then there are multiple hidden layers of neurons that are processing. And there's an entire architecture of the network below here, which is essentially an art. And in this process of this activation functions in these multiple layers that are using essentially thresholding to decide during the training process, it's that part that cannot be replicated by a conventional functional relationship. So that is basically the success of the networks when they actually work. So this is a very short primer. Now, in convolutional neural networks, we take into account spatial structure, and that is the key in porous media. So you capture 2D and 3D spatial interactions by performing a series of convolution operations, so-called filters. Now, filters have been around. Every differential operator, I assume that you have seen one. Every differential operator that acts on a numerical grid is essentially can be looked at as a filter. And there is a myriad of filters that basically combine a neighborhood, sort of a square neighborhood of these numerical cells, and filters them. And in the process, you downscale the image and sort of embed that information into a downscaled image. Now, this process actually does create general models that are reusable. So after I train it on a set of images, I can give it a new image and ask it to ask for a prediction. Now, just to give you a little bit of more intuitive idea about convolutions and filters. So technically, you take sort of a neighborhood that is described by a kernel of the convolution, and you slide it down your image. This is a 2D example. And as you slide it every neighborhood, you produce a new number, and that gives you a filtered image. So here's an example. You go through, and you get sort of what we call a feature map that in this particular case has picked out diagonal edges. Okay, again, there could be multiple filters. The art is actually to figure out which filters work. If I go in with 60 possible filters that I provide as an input to the network, well, that might be computationally too expensive. Now, here are some prior applications of this. There's a lot of image recognition, which is equivalent to segmentation into, for instance, pores and solids in porous media, which I'm not addressing in this talk. I'm just assuming that it's done. But there's a lot of work in that area for convolutional neural networks, or CNNs. But we are focusing on flow problems. And here's some work that came prior or somewhat contemporary to us, to our work. When we started this work, there was really just two-dimensional inputs. So in this particular case from 2016, authors looked at a 2D problem, and they did come up with a velocity field. However, it wasn't all that good. The errors were pretty large. Then in 2018, the researchers tried to predict permeability in itself through us, and they trained it on a number of 2D images again. And we came in with 3D at the same time. There's some work, and now there's actually a number of work available that uses 3D inputs, and Kamrava and others try to predict permeability. We are actually trying to predict velocity field. So our workflow takes a binary image, and even though it's really seductive to just give binary image and let a number of convolutions or standard filters process it, and then go through a neural network to produce a velocity field, that doesn't work. So that kind of is the simplest way, and it actually fails. We needed to go through a process of choosing additional features and inputs, and they're crucial. And some of them are actually quite common in the image characterization that we have used over the years, such as Euclidean distance field within the pore space. So that's the distance to the closest grain. Maximum inscribed spheres, which is similar. And then time of flight in our case from left to the right side or from right to the left side. One could also use things like tortuosity and so forth. So those are some characterizations that we have over the years used, and sort of without them, they're not the simple convolutions. Without them, this process has not worked. So in terms of input selections, I'm going to introduce it a little more. So our target is producing this or predicting this velocity field. Here it's shown in X direction to the example. So this is how Euclidean distance field is imaged. So this is the largest distance, and then the red is the smallest distance to the grains is shown. We tested a number of them, such as connectivity from left to right in different directions, porosity estimation, maximum inscribed sphere, or tortuosity. So those are certain features that we used in this work. If you look at them from geostatistical perspective and attempt to just do multilinear regression of them, that's not working. That's something that we have known for years, but basically this is just to show you that just a simple multilinear regression doesn't work. So predicted velocity, this is relative error in log 10 space. So basically actual average is over multiple orders of magnitude. So this type of prediction using multilinear regression does not work. Now, nevertheless, that type of analysis did tell us that all of these features that we looked at, such as Euclidean distances, connectivity, porosity, tortuosity, and so forth, have this they're very much influence the velocity field, but the relationships are very nonlinear, so therefore multilinear regression does not work. So let me now introduce how we come up with the velocity field. This is very high level. This is not a talk about a method that produces velocity field. And velocity field, or how you come up with it in this particular work, is actually in itself was not relevant. We just assume that it's there. Lattice-Boltzmann is one of the most commonly used methods to produce a velocity field. I'm going to, again, in a high level, just show you with a little movie how it works. So assume that these are grains, this is in 2D again. At each pore voxel or node, we have a finite set of velocities. Here there's 9 that groups of particles could move into. So what we're actually moving around is distributions of particles. This comes from sort of gas ideas and how gas moves around. You just kind of snap that gas to a grid. Now, as you go through the process, you initialize sort of with the whatever you might want to, maybe 0, and then you impose a pressure gradient. Whoops, and this should show a movie how basically you're streaming these groups of particles. They bounce into the walls that actually bounce them back into the pore space. In that process, you basically adjust the velocity field to something that indeed flows through this porous medium. Now, this can be actually proven that under certain set of conditions, you will arrive at the solution of the Navier-Stokes equation. So again, I'm not going to belabor the point. We used Lattice-Boltzmann, but one could use anything that produces velocity field. And that is our true solution that we're trying to replicate or train CNNs with. Now, the problem with Lattice-Boltzmann, however simple that movie looked, and conceptually it's actually simple and parallelizable, but nevertheless, you can take anywhere from hours to days on parallel computing, because for instance, in this particular test, as your porosity decreases, it is harder to equilibrate, and the space is more tortuous, and that results in longer running times. So again, it is still not something that one would call real time, even if it's widely available. Now, convolutional neural network here is from Ginther 2015 work. So we have borrowed something that has worked for computer vision quite a bit. And you can see that it's quite, the network structure in itself is quite complicated. What we give it as input is geometric features on 80 cube subsamples of an image that was originally 1,000 1,000 images that was 1,000 subsamples of an image that actually overlap. So that kind of provides us with the continuity of the flow field. And all of those geometric inputs that I mentioned that we need to actually provide as input, that is what actually flows into the network. And we train it with Lattice-Boltzmann simulation of velocity. And I will show training images in a second. So basically our training set were sphere packs that were so-called digitally cemented, and that gave us a range of porosities. And we use that on one GPU with 24 gigabytes of memory. Now this is a sample that is available on the Digital Rocks portal. So we had a range of porosities, but the pore spaces were sort of a simulated sandstone or simple cementation process. What was interesting is that then we tested this on real data. So Fontainebleau sandstone is still pretty simple, and there is a project that has a number of porosities available. So we tested them on those, as well as number of others. So we actually gave it limestone, Kasselge sandstone, multi-scale microsand, and I'm actually curious why this network do so well on a multi-scale image, because it wasn't trained with one, and Benheimer sandstone. All of this data is available on Digital Rocks portal. So when we actually process the velocity fields that we get with a neural network and compare them to the actual solution in those same images that we compute as part of the validation, we can actually see that predicted versus true permeability computed based on those velocity fields is pretty accurate. And at the same time, so you can see these Fontainebleau sandstones, which were similar to the training set, and these additional test sets that are not so similar, and still the neural network does really well. I will be honest with you, in some cases, we did get, or more heterogeneous media, we did get actually a result that the network was off by 50% or so, and we technically cannot explain it. That's one of the drawbacks of this method. So we do definitely need more training, but this is quite an amazing prediction. And just to compare the the times, once you actually have a CNN, it's going to give you a result based on your input image in terms of seconds, not days or hours. Now, this is just to show you a cross-section of the relative error. This is relative error, sort of a point-wise relative error that goes in places up to 50%, but once you actually compute the permeability, it is pretty accurate. Now, in conclusion, CNNs are successful in using 3D geometric features to predict steady-state laminar flow field. A model is trained only with sphere packs and slightly consolidated sphere packs, but it's then performing well on different domains of including non-consolidated samples, synthetic heterogeneous geometries, and some sandstones and carbonates. Now, this is definitely a good step in the right direction. Machines are not taking over just yet. We need more lithology-specific training. We need to also look into multi-phase flow, larger images, and we will actually look at really training with heterogeneous images. So please see us at the upcoming AGU fall meeting, as well as flow phenomena on different scales. In my group, there's quite a bit of the development of absorption in modeling in shale, and we're trying to speed up molecular dynamics simulations to match that. So for details, all of these details are available in the paper recently published in Advances in Water Resources. And well, paper is available, data is on Digital Rocks portal, and if you go to Javier's GitHub, there's also code available that you can use. Okay. So I would like to thank my co-authors. The majority of the work was done by Javier and Hongjun and Duo, and then Drs. Landry and Perch. And the rest of my research group, people working on Digital Rocks portal, Texas Advanced Computer Center resources, as well as funding. And if you have any questions, my email is right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Masha, for this excellent talk. It was really inspiring, I think. I learned a lot. And I already see a few comments and a number of questions. And I would like to hand over to Sebastian to handle and moderate the questions.
Thank you very much, Masha, for this excellent talk. Yeah, a number of questions coming in. The first one is from Leila Hashemi. So she says, thank you for the great presentation. Is there any specific limitation using artificial intelligence to predict multi-phase transport properties at the micro or pore scale? There was a number of comments followed up.
That is definitely coming up. I think in terms of, so here's, we are working on multi-phase as well. Having data to train with multiple, so you need much more because you don't have geometry sort of only as the as the parameter. You also have wettability and all of the different so mineral content and so forth that can influence the multi-phase as well. So much more data is needed. So I think in that sense we are getting there, but it's not that you can go online somewhere and download all of the possible data that you might need to train properly. However, I'm actually hopeful that, again, we are little by little gathering enough data. Our initial attempt to just look into descriptors such as porosity, contact angle, or whatever, those are average properties, and to link average properties to average petrophysical properties like permeability or that has not so far been successful. It's actually much better. This spatial structure have the first order influence. So I actually trust this CNN, even if it's more involved, computationally involved to train. I actually trust these efforts to actually speed up simulation. And I think where we're going is that you will never just have this magic button and just have a prediction. But with enough data, you can actually speed up. So possibly in a multi-phase flow scenarios, you can speed up every point to point and still have some great benefit and to approach that real-time simulation. Because both simulation and experimentation take a long time. So, but we do need a lot of experimental data.
Thank you. And I should point out your co-author, Javi, has commented and pointed the audience to a paper where you have some preliminary results on two-phase flow displacement machine learning. We have a question from Patrick Fun. Thank you for the insightful presentation. For CNN prediction of the velocity field, have you tried to predict the velocity field for real rock images directly?
Yes, that was our test set number 2 in the presentation. So we trained them on sort of sphere packs, which are artificial, and then we used them on sandstones and some carbonates. And curiously enough, I wasn't expecting good behavior in carbonates, but in some of them it behaved. It actually produced a very good result.
And somewhat related, you mentioned carbonates as a question from Wen Pin Yong. Thank you for the great presentation. Do you mind to share your opinion how significant microporosities in carbonate rocks and how do it contribute to flow permeability? Is that something you think you can tackle with machine learning?
Yes, if we can on every scale, so every imaging resolution is limited to a certain sort of window that you see. How good are your glasses? And you need better and better glasses down to X-ray and SEM glasses as you go down in scale. So question is, do we have that information? And can we then, so these CNNs, they don't operate in vacuum. They need the data to actually be trained so they can make a prediction. That said, I do. So microporosity can contribute quite a bit. It can also contribute in terms of, especially when you come down to like multi-phase flow, and the spatial configuration of microporosity. Is it connected? Is it disconnected? How much of it do we have, and what is its spatial distribution in 3D? That can definitely, that we already know from the simulation we have, so it can contribute quite a bit.
We do have a question from Martin Blunt, who you mentioned so kindly in your talk. Martin again says, thanks you for the fascinating talk. He asked, the digital rock portal is a wonderful resource. Do you have images from non-rock materials, for example, gas diffusion layers, biological materials, membranes, etc.?
Thank you, Martin, for that question. So this is something as infrastructure, and I kind of learned about the curation of data much more than I wanted to really. I really just wanted to connect data and simulation. And there is something that is a problem with Digital Rocks portal. It has a label called rock. So I am actually working, and I have a proposal, and hopefully NSF will hear it, to basically move up and replicate that for different other media. So I am seeing down the line Digital Rocks portal, but then down the line also digital nanomaterials portal, or digital fuel cells, or digital, for that matter, skeletal morphology, and bones are porous as well, right? So we could actually have multiple portals that have this data. And what I'm pointing is actually quite important. I have had people contact me, and they would like to deposit the data in Digital Rocks portal, but they don't like the rock label, and they don't feel that that's their community. So in that sense, we do actually have somewhat specialized portals that go community by community, even though at the bottom of it, there's a lot of, it's flow in porous media, or basically transport in porous media. It could be different types of transport. So I'm hoping 3 years from now to see Digital Rocks portal replicated.
Thank you. We do have a question from Vasya Dina. I do have a suspicion this is Vasily Demyanov. If it is you, Vasily, hello. you mentioned that the CNN trained on a single scale image was able to predict velocity patterns in multi-scale structures that it has not been trained with. Do you have an explanation for it?
I do. The range of so in one case it was a limestone and it didn't have a large range of pore sizes, and we were testing it with that image. If there was microporosity within, we didn't know about it, or we didn't have it as part of our simulation. Okay? So it was tested against a single scale simulation. In the second part, there was actually this multi-scale sand. There was microporosity within every grain, and it was artificially created to create a multi-scale medium, but it was well resolved in that image. And basically, this replication within the sand resembled in its spatial structure something that we normally see in sandstones. So that's why I think it worked well.
A question from Kirash, again, thanking you for the talk. For dynamic systems where the velocity field varies with time, do we need to train the neural network for every time step, or do we do it just once?
Well, you need to train it with enough. So if neural network or training sees only cats and dogs and you're asking it to label, then when you give it an image of a crocodile, it's going to tell you that it's 60% certain that it's a dog. So in that sense, we need network to see most of the interesting stuff that determines the flow. In terms of, for instance, wettability and time, and especially how it changes in time dynamically, we need that information to train the network, or we need enough static images that have all of the dependencies within. So that is and then I do believe that it can actually certainly provide a much better prediction than any other Kalman-Kozeny relationship type that we have right now. Because it acknowledges the spatial heterogeneity.
So there's a lot of chat going on, and Javier is also busy helping answering your question.
I have tasked Javier to engage.
So it's really nice because we are then also have the written comments, so to speak. We have a question from Mustafa Seba. This is it's a basic question. I'd like to know more about the basic segmentation challenges you face. What were the efforts that have been done? Would you apply filters to help, or better start without it? Thank you.
So I have actually something just to. So image classification in terms of photos has worked really well so far. I mean, your phone can recognize you, right? So in that sense, in photo analysis, it's much easier to find trained eyes and basically do a community effort in gathering information. So there's a Berkeley photo benchmark collection of various photos where segmentation is actually identifying different regions in this image. So different users, 5 per image, were tasked to basically go and trace. So in this case, they're going to trace a fish. And ultimately, even though there are differences between the users, the algorithms will figure out that, oh, there's a fish in this image, right? Now, for geosciences, our images look like this, for instance, from microscopy. And it requires a master's or a PhD to actually label it. And even then, there is actually always a discussion going on of what it is that we see. And a single image is not necessarily enough. We need to have multiple modalities to compare. So in that sense, what we are actually missing in geosciences, or where geosciences are behind, is in these labeled images or labeled pairs. So if I'm working with tomographic data or SEM data, it doesn't really matter. I need segmented labeled pairs to be able to train the network. If we actually have that, then I think deep learning can really help, but it requires careful training and benchmarks. Mm-hmm. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think it does. Thank you, Masha. Question from Rahel Ahmed. What's the size of the data used for training the CNNs to predict the presented results?
So we did the 500 cube in this artificially created cemented sphere packs, and that is representative for that type of medium. So there were 500 cube images. You can scale them any way you want because it was a sphere pack initially. And then we tested them on pretty much any image. It could be 500 cube, it could be 1,000 cube, whatever was actually posted on the Digital Rocks portal. So that would give you, in terms of, we trained it on something that has about 10 grains on a side. If you think about a granular or a sandstone type of medium. So it's as representative as that cube is. We are working now on multi-scale approaches as well that can handle images that have more heterogeneity within and not necessarily segmented.
Thank you. I do have a question, Masha. There are obviously different machine learning techniques available. You focus on CNN. Is there a particular reason why you use CNN? Are there advantages of CNN compared to vector support techniques, for example? So is there something that works, from your experience, a machine learning technique that works particularly well or particularly poorly?
Yes, so what works in general images, and this is why we use that, is this process of this downscaling. So it does account for a local spatial structure, and sort of in the downscaling, it propagates it. We, for flow, also needed to, since flow is not static, and one side, if you're trying to equilibrate steady state flow across a porous medium, then your one end will influence the other. I mean, you're kind of connected across that. And that connection across sort of the larger image was actually created using this other additional features. So this part, the convolutional neural network about accounting for spatial structure, is borrowed from previous work in computer vision. Simply from a lot of videos that are processed daily on YouTube or such websites. But then we had to add it to it something that is very specific to porous media to enrich that those features to actually work for flow prediction.
Thank you.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we did, it's a technology, I call it a technology transfer, right? Okay. So from computer vision.
Rusty has another question. Which filters have you found had the impact most on the predictions?
Well, the ones that I presented, those are the 4 winners. There's basically Euclidean distance from one side to the other, also time of flight, and maximum inscribed spheres. And without them, you can't. And original images as well. But you have to add those to the traditional convolutions and filters in order to work well. So something that basically imparts pore size knowledge.
Okay. I see Javi is also commenting that the local tortuosity was crucial.
Crucial.
For predictions.
Yes, that was actually, this is a more complete set. Oh, no, where is it? The more complete set was actually here. So these are all of the ones that we tested. And if you actually do statistical tests, you see that they are heavily correlated with the ultimate velocity. It's just that that correlation is non-linear, so traditional regression approaches do not work. And that have been actually tried over the years. We've been trying to predict flow for a while using geometric features. This is not news.
So don't see any further questions coming up. I don't know if anyone is still... there's one more question from Kiarash. Do you think using AI/ML for physical simulation is going to take over the conventional simulations, solving numerical PDEs? What are the limitations?
You will never hear me that one particular approach will just take over and be the magic solution. That's not how science works. What I think really greatly is hope here is that they work together to speed things up, and together with experimental data. Nothing really works in isolation, in my sense. But I think there's really just, I look at these approaches as a help in integrating results. and integrating honoring spatial structure, which a standard correlation or a sort of a functional relationship of the upscaled parameters cannot do, because porosity as a number does not have spatial information. It's a single number. So in that sense, I see it as greatly aiding simulation and speeding it up. But the moment we resolve one problem, we need to move on to the next. There's so much complexity in transport in porous media that we're just going to keep going.
We take one final question because time is slowly running out, and we want to give Maren the opportunity to announce next week's seminar. Jackson Andreas asks, how do the results of image analysis compare to the results from traditional laboratory? How do the results of image analysis compare to results from traditional laboratory experiments?
So in image analysis, there are two things. There's first the characterization part, which actually gives you this poor solid, in the simplest case, image. That in itself is an area called segmentation that has a lot of work done, and it's still fundamental. It influences the results in the simulation later on quite a bit, and we still have certain uncertainty built within. I'd say simpler sandstones are fine. More complex media, there's a space in there because there could be some average properties that come from submicron scale that we don't have, for instance, in an X-ray image. So there is the characterization part, and then you give it to a simulator. Simulators, there's a pretty good, this was not part of this topic, but there's a large body of work that basically just compares simulation to the laboratory experiments. One has to be careful is that simulation and experiments typically, in most common sense, they happen on different scales. So we will do a laboratory experiment in a larger core, and you simulate in a subset of that. So with the understanding that that subset is representative of the whole, then the match is good. There's a lot of now imaged experiments, and they're getting up to the speed that we can actually compare in time. And this is where we're finding out that we need more and more information on small scale, for instance, mineralogy and wettability of surfaces. And that's typically information that has to be provided to the simulator in order to have a good match. So it's something that is like, it's moving forward for sure. I would say it's a good match for a simpler media and single and two-phase flow.
Thank you very much, Masha, for excellent talk and answering all the different questions so patiently and lots of insight. Hand over to Maren for some final comments announcing next week's speaker.
Well, and thank you again for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Masha, again. It was really interesting. I learned a lot. Yeah, I don't know, Sebastian, do you have a slide? I know that next week, same time, same location, you will welcome, and it's our great pleasure to hear Andrew Curtis speaking next week. Sebastian, do you have a title? Because I don't have.
Yes, so Andrew Curtis, I don't have the title off the top of my head, but Andrew Curtis is going to speak about some really exciting work that's not too dissimilar from what you're working on, Masha, in terms of some image processing, image analysis, but on a much larger scale. So he's going to talk about how you can use some really interesting ways to image the subsurface using seismic waves and seismic interferometry. So 3D imaging.
Slight difference in scale. Slight difference
in scale,
6 to 10 orders of magnitude, but that's okay.
Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for attending today. Thank you, Maren, for co-hosting, and thank you, Masha, for your talk. And we see you all next week at Andrew Curtis's talk, I hope. Stay healthy.